We are really pleased to have all of you with us here for this presentation of Ragini. I just received this document, and also personally, I know her. She's my senior. I'm also pursuing PhD under Dr. D. Uma Devi ma'am. And I would now welcome Ragini to present her paper. But before that, I'll give a short brief and bio about her. She's currently pursuing a PhD from Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies from University of Delhi. And she has participated in many national and international conferences in India, and her papers have been published in books by Vishwa Bharati Research Center, Pune, India. Currently, she's working to theoretically reconceptualize eco-criticism by studying Kalidasa's works and Sangam poems. She has done her BA in English from Kamala Nehru College, MA in English, and lots of certificates, advanced certificates like gender studies from the Women's Studies and Development Center. She also pursued her MPhil in comparative Indian literature from the same Department of MIL and LS. She worked, her dissertation was on comparative study of Sanskrit poetics and Greek poetics. And currently, she's working for her PhD. She's working on reconceptualizing eco-criticism, like I just mentioned. So I would now request and invite Ragini to please start with her paper, or she wants to add something to about herself. And please start with her paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruchi, and thank you so much, Uma ma'am, for and Department of Modern Indian Languages for providing me this opportunity. I seriously do not want to add anything because I think that's enough. So I'll begin with my presentation. So today's presentation is on a comparative understanding of Iraichi, Ulurai, and Dhwani. The first two concepts, which are Iraichi and Ulurai, are from Tolkappiyam, which was a text written by Tolkappiyar, and it was written in around 2nd century BCE, and the third concept Dhwani was written by Anandavardhan. Anandavardhan in his text Dhwanaya Loka, which is a 9th century CE, 9th century AD text. So let me begin with my first slide. Tolkappiyam and Dhwanalok are these are the epoch-making works in Indian aesthetics. And Tolkappiyam, as we know, is a treatise on grammar and poetics, which is commonly assigned to pre-Christian era, as I mentioned, around 2nd century to 1st century BCE. And it speaks of a poetic tradition very much like the one embodied in Sangam poetry. Sangam era, as we may say, is the era of Sangam literature is generally considered from 300 BC to 300 AD. That is the suggested era that we consider of Sangam literature. And Tolkappiyam also hints at literary compositions of an earlier period, which may be called classical period. Anandavardhan, who lived in the 9th century AD, composed this text, Dhwanaya Loka, and he has talked about Indian aesthetics as well in detail, which was written in Sanskrit. And it belongs to a tradition of Sanskrit aestheticians, and his predecessors were Bharata, who wrote Natya Shastra, Bhamaha, Udbhat, and Vamana. So in Dhwanaya Loka, I do not know what just happened. Okay, so in Dhwanaya Loka, it's a systematic treatise. I do not know what's happening. Why are the blue marks are happening on the...
Okay, Ragini, sorry to interrupt you. There are small icons just below if you can see. So you can start the slideshow so that you can zoom it and we can see clearly what is there.
All right.
At the bottom, right bottom, you can see there are small icons right inside. Yeah.
Well, these blue markings, I do not know how they appeared.
It's okay, we can read. It's okay, we can read.
Right.
You can carry on.
I did not do anything. All right. So it's a treatise, which it was written to talk about how poetry has its symbolized meaning, and how poetry is understood via its suggestive meanings. And Anandavardhan claims that Dhwani is the quintessence, it is the essence of poetry. And just as Rasa, it is so what Anandavardhan is basically trying to say is that just like Dhwani is the essential part of poetry, similarly Rasa is the essential part of Dhwani. So without Dhwani, understanding the concept of Dhwani, you cannot understand what Rasa is, how to achieve a meaning, how to understand the meaning of a poetry via coming to understand Rasa. And Tolkappiyar, on the other hand, has given a cryptic account of what Iraichi and Ulurai are. So basically, what Ulurai was, it was in a in a work of poetry. Ulurai is basically talking about explicit symbolism, which implies that anything you read in poetry, it is clear to you what the poet is talking about. Whereas Iraichi, in this way, it means that there is a deeper emotional meaning beyond that. You cannot just directly decipher the meaning. So Ulurai is the explicit symbolism that the reader has to understand. And what Iraichi is there is a deeper emotional meaning involved, which implies that there are different levels. It is not directly inferred from while having a reading of poetry. Another meaning, another difference between Ulurai and Iraichi is that first of all, Ulurai is uh, the meaning that you derive from words, as in the first aspect I said that you can decipher the meaning directly. So basically, you read a word, you read the words of poetry, you get the meaning straight away. Whereas in Iraichi, what is happening is that the inner meaning is not transparent. You have to understand it by there are different levels of meanings, that there is a symbolism that is involved, and the meaning is and included in poetry beyond the words. You have to the meaning is there, transcending the words. You have to understand the symbolical meaning of it. And then Dhwani is what Anandavardhan was talking about, is that when the poet writes, he creates a resonant field of emotions. The poet is basically writing a poetry when he has some emotions in his mind, and he is writing that the entire section of poetry. So to understand that, poetry or the reader or hearer must be on the same wavelength. You cannot just read a poetry and the listener gets the meaning straight away. It doesn't happen that way. There has to be a stereotypical, a perfect connection, that you have to resonate at the same wavelength to understand the meaning. And this method requires a sensitivity on the parts of both writer, that is the poet, and the listener or the reader who's reading the poetry. So you have to connect with the poet to understand the meaning. So these three concepts are closely examined with reference to the poems in which they are basically talked about, and they reveal complex and subtle Indian aesthetic thought was even in the distant past. So this implies that there are complex implications of these three concepts that I have basically talked about in this presentation. So there are three aphorisms on Iraichi. Aphorism is a statement, one can say, or who can give you meaning as when there it's like a statement, a metaphorical statement as such. It's a direct statement that is giving you some meaning. So there are three aphorisms on Iraichi and Tolkappiyam's Poruliyal, and three more references to it in Karpiyal and Periyal. So these are the parts of the text, Tolkappiyam. And coming to the second statement, it's the materials of a poem. There are given prominence by Tolkappiyar, and the things are the three materials that are being given importance are Mutal, the first things, that is time and place, where the situation is taking place or where the incident is taking place, that is termed as Mutal, the place and the time. And next is Karu, which is the things born into or native to a region. And Uri, the human's feelings appropriately set in Mutal or Karu. So these are the three materials that are of a poem that are involved. So Iraichi basically, I think now you okay. So Iraichi, another meaning that is involved is that it denotes the flora and fauna, that is the plants and animals of a landscape as used in scenes depicting the love of birds and animals in order to intensify the affections felt by human characters. So when we are reading the poetry, which see basically in Sangam literature, there are two sections of poetry that are involved. That is Aham and Puram. So Aham is talking about the inner meaning, and Puram is talking about the uh, outside aspects of a poetry. So therein, when you are reading, basically Ulur and Iraichi are encompassed, are included in the Aham section of poetry. So Puram is not generally involved here. So there, where which is in Aham section, which denotes the flora and fauna. So and in two of the aphorisms in Karpiel, these are the two poetry, the 1094 and 1116. These are the poems that are being talked about. So in two of the aphorisms, Tolkapir makes passing references to Iraichi to indicate its place in the heroines and servants' utterances. So when you're reading it, you are when they are having a conversation, you are getting the meaning straight away. So that is why Iraichi is referred here. The place is referred and the conversation of heroine and servant is being understood. So they further clarify that the allusions will be to the scenes of love among birds and animals witnessed on the way, and that the prime motive for inclusion of such occurrences will be to induce and sustain the emotion of love in the hero or the heroine. So when they are having the conversation, like if a heroine is having a conversation with a friend, so she's basically talking about that how she's feeling for the hero or the man whom she loves, her beloved. So it is basically a passing reference when the conversation is taking place. So when you read this aham poem, you while reading you understand, okay, so she's describing her love. So there is no need to go in detail, and there is no symbolic meaning that is involved here. So as I said that Iraichi abounds in Sangam poems, and in some poems it appears as a mere description of the place. And Ayangar has the following piece by Odalandayar, which is I have talked about here. They have come crossing even the hot forking desert paths where the sharp-toothed red dogs of the jungle, this is the translation by the way, and wait by the cactus clump to kill a wild pig for his mate, now suffering pangs of labor. All the way they have come with you, O heart, the gentle ways of the woman you love. So what is happening here is that the hero tells his heart that the sterling character of the lady he loves has come all the way to the wilderness, in which the red dog, in order to feed his pregnant mate, is on the lookout for a wild pig. And as separated from his sweetheart, the lover describes his agony, and setting chosen is in accordance with the feeling expressed. So, the connection of time and place is happening here, as I talked about in the previous slide. The Palai region, a wasteland parched by summer, being the place, the cactus plant and animals like red dog and wild pig found in such regions constitute the Karaporal. Here, the Karaporal has no hidden meaning, though it serves well to express the pangs of separation intensely felt
रागिनी
by.
थोड़ा रागिनी सॉरी
Yes,
फॉर द
sir.
इंटरप्शन
Yeah.
रागिनी थोड़ा सा वॉइस इंक्रीज करके बात करो बिकॉज somebody
Okay.
told that the voice is not clear.
Okay, ma'am. From here it's at the maximum level. Maybe I'll have to.
माइक तुम्हारे पास है?
No, there is no mic, but
ओके ठीक है थोड़ा
you can hear me, isn't it? Can
yes,
everyone?
some people messaged me.
Okay, so maybe then I'll
थोड़ा
increase my voice.
loudly.
Yeah, okay, I'll
ठीक
be a bit louder. So Karapural has no hidden meaning, though it serves well to express the pangs of separation. So in the previous, in this section, what is happening that he's he's expressing his consent that he is a bit sad that he is separated from his lover. And here the Karaporal has no hidden meaning, though it serves well to express the pangs of separation intensely felt by the protagonist. And a poem in Kali Tokai dramatizes the agony of a love-lorn lady who tells a friend that her lover who has gone to secure wealth will certainly return. So basically, the conversations that are happening, the conversation in therein, what is happening is that a friend consoles the heroine that he's definitely going to return, you need not worry. And even the hero of the poem, he also somehow consoles himself by talking to the objects around him, the natural objects around him, which may be the flora and the fauna, though because there is no human around him, he somehow feels consoled that okay, if I express my feelings, so maybe I'll feel a bit better. So it is just the expression of the feelings that is happening here. And the heroine's friend is saying that because he will come across several scenes of male animals and birds showering their love and affection on their mates, so whenever he looks uh, at the animals, when he looks at the animals where the mating is happening, so he thinks about his lover and he starts missing her. So this is what happened. And the Aham convention associates fatigued elephants. The basically the Aham section of poetry, what it talks about, it associates fatigued elephants, doves, desert trees, bamboo, stagnant water, burning sun, and Palai region, and with theme of separation from the lover. In such poems, Karaporul explicitly becomes Iraichi. Besides being a pleading idyllic account, Iraichi may become suggestive. It may become suggestive, but it doesn't have to be suggestive. As I said, that it is the explicit meaning that you get when you are reading this section of poetry. The best kind of Iraichi is the one which induces by its sensuous appeals feelings of love, affection for one's beloved, and assumes a connotative dimension. So, as the example was mentioned, coming to Ulurai, it is another related concept which seems to have been subtly distinguished from Iraichi by the ancient Tamil bards, in Sangam poetry, Sangam literature. Different composers of Sangam poetry have described Ulurai as different from Iraichi, as I also talked in the beginning, that it is um, the metaphorical meaning that has to be different from the direct meaning that you are inferring while reading a poem. So Tolkapir defines it again cryptically in different places in Porulatikaram. Porulatikaram is one of the parts of Tolkapiyam. It's one of the three parts of the Tolkapiyam where and in Porulatikaram the sections of Aham and Puram poetry have been talked about. So Poruliyal has 5 more aphorisms that indicate the 5 types of Ulurai. And the mediators between lovers express their views explicitly, and their utterances will have no hidden meaning. Okay, so let's move on to it. What is Ulurai? A traditionally more polite mode of expression is of 5 kinds: Udhanurai, Ulurai Ubavam, Sutta Nakai, and Sirappu. And okay, so the basically the literal meanings what could be of these is that it is the first one, it is the sense that is found within. The second one is that the Ulurai Uvavam, it is inset that serves as a simile. And the third one, Sutu, is metaphorical Ulurai. Naghai is inner sense hidden in sarcasm, and Sirapu is aggrandizement. And besides conveying a hidden meaning, Ulurai causes immense delight. Just like when people who might be familiar with Sanskrit poetics and the concept of Dhwani, as I will be coming to it. So when you are through Dhwani, you come to the understanding of meaning of a poem, and that is how you achieve rasa, and that is how you achieve delight. Similarly, here it's happening that besides conveying a hidden meaning, Ulurai causes immense delight. So it is only through the hidden meaning and the symbolic meaning that you decipher, that you understand, and you feel pleasure in that. The same is happening when you must have, all of you must have heard of the term catharsis, as talked about by Aristotle in Poetics. That is another aspect, but it's similar what is happening here. So olurai may consist in propitious utterances, words of abuse or contemptuous references to the hero's valor. And another things that are involved in Sirappu are anger, ignorance, jealousy, party. So all these meanings that you infer, these may be not directly symbolized, but you somehow, after reading the poetry, you get to that meaning. Okay, this is happening. That the person is feeling angry. The feeling of jealousy is involved. So it is the hidden you understand. Okay, and Tolkappir has given a cryptive account of Ulurai and Iraichi. These concepts reveal how subtle and complex was Indian aesthetics thought in the distant past. And according to Tolkappir, who wrote Tolkappiyam, it is Ulurai is the implied or suggested meaning, exclusively used in Aham love poems, as I talked about, and and it consists of 5 kinds, as I talked in the previous slide. And Sirappu, it again, as I have mentioned before, it is the implicit expression of love hidden in the explicit form of expression. So what this means is that, okay, you are reading the section of poetry, but it is the implicit expression of love that you infer from it. That is the Sirappu part of Ulurai. And again, anger, jealousy, and all these things are involved. And Ulurai Uvavam, again, the implied simile. I have repeated these things so that it makes clear. It gets clear. Okay, so though the object of the analogy is not expressed, but rather is inferred, as I mentioned, the poet gives some clues to infer this inner sense. You have to decipher the clues from while reading the poetry, and it depends from reader to reader how you come to the understanding of the suggested meaning that is involved in the poem. But another thing is that I can this is what I think, that one can say that different meanings that are inferred are different. They vary from readers or listeners. So there does not have to be one suggested meaning. There can be several suggested meanings because of your experiences, or what you have been reading, or what you have been going through. So it depends on that as well. The explicit meaning may be one, but the suggested meanings that a particular reader infers, they may vary from one listener or a reader to another. So the subject matter is considered incomplete without this Ulurai Vamam. And as it is there, it becomes the part and parcel of the poem. On the other hand, Nakha is the inner sense derived through a sarcastic statement, and Suttu is the metaphorical interpretation. Further, there are 2 factors that determine the meaning of a poem, that is irony and symbol. Irony is the dissimulation in its root sense, and verbal irony can be compared with the Naghai and Sirappu Ulurais, and it is a statement in which the implicit meaning intended by the speaker is different from the explicit meaning of the words uttered. So basically what these parts are doing is that ultimately there are different ways of expression, maybe through a simile, maybe through a metaphor, maybe through a sarcasm, maybe through a different time and place. But the ultimate motive is that you understand what the suggested meaning is. You try to reach to that level to get what the poet is talking about. So symbol, however, denotes something else. And in literature, it is applied only to a word or a set of words that signifies an event or an object, which in itself signifies something else. So it becomes different tier of meanings. There are different stages of meanings that you somehow try to reach, and you somehow get the suggested meaning. And it depends on a series of words, it depends on a series of sentences. You connect those words and then you infer, okay, this is what is being talked about. It does not have to be just the literal meaning. And there are personal symbols, traditional symbols, natural symbols. The connection or association between the word and the extra meaning denoted by it is obviously there. The connection is there, the clues are there. It is on you that you decipher the clue and you get to that meaning, the symbolic meaning. And specifically in Ulurai Uravam, the natural things represent something which shows the character of the lovers. there can be natural objects involved, and then you understand, okay, the lovers are being talked about in the poem and in analogy with each other, thereby becoming symbols for the lovers and their actions. So it is through various objects, it is the presence of various natural objects through which you understand, okay, these are the lovers. We can connect that us that even the objects are artificial, but it is the human beings, it is the lovers that are being talked about. So with respect to this, the symbolism found in Sangam literature is useful to comprehend the theory itself in its several aspects. So it is um, the symbolism when you are studying Sangam literature, which is a massive magnum opus written by various composers, various poets. So it is through that you understand this theory. You apply these theories, you apply these concepts, then you get to the meanings of the different Aham poems. Coming to Anandavardhan's text, it explains the nature of Dhwani and presents it as the meeting point of all principles of Sanskrit literary theory. So he's trying to say that it is the nucleus, it is the kernel where all Sanskrit literary theories meet, and it is through that kernel, it is through that nucleus that all the Sanskrit literary theories get their meaning from. So claiming that suggestion is both the essential part of all first-rate writings and the most beautiful principle of poetry, the great Sanskrit aesthetician defines it in the following manner. So without, what he's trying to say in Dhwanayaloka, that without Dhwani, there is no possibility that a poem should be written. This is what he wrote in his text. So what he said, that that meaning which wins the admiration of refined critics is decided to be the soul of poetry. So it is only the refined critics. This term means here that who are familiar with the different suggested different levels of reaching the rasa meaning, or the final suggested meaning of a poetry. So it is not, basically he was saying that it is not for a layman to understand what the poetry is talking about. So the explicit and the implicit are regarded as its two aspects, and the explicit is commonly known, obviously, and it has been already set forth in many ways through figures of speech. And but the implicit aspect is quite different from this. In the words of first-rate poets, it shines supreme and towers above the beauty of the striking external constituents, even as charm in ladies. So that meaning alone is the soul of poetry. He's trying to say is that, okay, the explicit meaning exists, but it is the absolute suggested meaning that forms the soul of poetry, that forms the nucleus of the poetry. And it is important that you understand that explicit meaning is all right, you can get contented with it, you can get satisfied by reading it, but then it is the ultimate goal is to reach the suggested meaning of the poetry, which forms the soul of it. The implicit meaning is entirely different from the explicit meaning, for sure, and it may be of the nature of a prohibition and the other of a positive proposal. And there's an instance that I have mentioned in translation here, like mother-in-law lies here, lost in sleep, and I hear those should mark these before it is dark. O traveler, blinded by night, tumble not into our beds aright. So what is happening here is that okay, that he's basically what explicit meaning you are getting. Okay, some person is sleeping, and you should consider that it is a dark time and it is before dark, though that the person is lost in sleep. But O traveler, the traveler who's there, you are blinded by night, but tumble not into our beds aright. That you should be returning at home before the person who's being talked about gets awake, and there is some chaos that could happen. So Anandavardhan observes that the inner meaning of a poem is not understood by a just knowledge of grammar and dictionary. It is not only through reading Sanskrit grammar or Sanskrit dictionary. It is not by reading the rules of Sanskrit that you can understand it. It is understood only by those who have an insight into the true significance of poetry. The suggested meaning flashes suddenly across the minds of perceptive critics when they move away from the literal meaning. That you have to shift from the literal meaning, only then you can have then only then you can travel on that path of suggested meaning. And only that kind of poetry in which conventional meaning renders itself secondary and suggests the intended meaning is designated by the learned as dhwani or suggestive poetry. So this is important, that only that kind of poetry that Anandavardhan is talking here is talking about here, is that in which the conventional meaning, that is the explicit meaning, doesn't have to be the standard meaning, doesn't have to be the most important meaning. It has to stand as secondary, but the primary meaning is the suggested one, and it is only achieved via understanding dhwani or suggested aspects of the poetry. Since suggestion is conditioned by only the relation between the suggester, I'm sorry about the word spelling mistake, the suggested and the suggested, it cannot be subsumed under the source of beauty in the expressed and the expression. So what is happening here in figures of speech such as condensed metaphor, parallelepsis, metonymy, periphrasis, fancy denial, etc.? The suggestion is not possible because the suggestive element is not exclusively important in them. So what he's trying to say is that no matter how many expressions, no matter how many figures of speech you use, the suggestive meaning is not achieved through that. In places we have just a glimmer of the implied, or where the implied is just handmade to the expressed, or where its primary importance is not clearly discernible, there is no suggestive meaning. If you do not find any clue, see, there has to be some clue that something is happening here. It is only when you are reading it that you somehow do get, okay, something is involved here, something, the suggestive meaning is here. If you do not find the clue, it does not mean that you have lost it. It's just that the suggestive meaning is not existing there. It could be just a mere collection of words. It could be just having an explicit meaning. Not all poetry, not all poems have to have a suggestive element. That is what he's saying. Okay, so rejecting the view that suggestion is non-existent, Anandavardhan points out that suggestion is twofold. Now, some critics during that time used to say that not suggestion, the suggested meaning exist all the time. So to counter that point of view, what he said that he points that the suggestion is twofold. It is achieved through two tiers of meanings, which is avivakshita vakya with unintended literal import, and vivaksita neapar vakya with intended but further extending literal import. What is happening in the first avivakshita vakya, which is with unintended literal import? What he means here is that the meaning is there, but it is unintended. He's not trying to the poet is not trying to literally trying to say what is happening. The meaning is unintended, you decipher it on your own. And the second part is saying, but the explicit meaning is intended, but that explicit meaning is leading you to another suggested meaning. That is what is happening in these two sections. So I'm not going to go much in details of it, because these concepts are further being classified, so I've avoided that. So first meaning, I would the first classification, I would again for the clarification, I'll again talk about them, that avivakshita vakya is the unintended literal import, that meaning is there, but you have to understand it. The literal import is there, the explicit import is there, but you have to understand it. The second is, I don't know why the markings are happening when touching the laptop. Okay, the second point says that the explicit meaning leads you to the suggested meaning. I have given examples of the first, which is avivakshita vakya, which is the unintended literal import. 3 persons will gather flowers of gold from the earth, the bold, the learned, and he who knows how to serve. Second, which was vivakshita paravakya, that is the explicit meaning will lead you to the suggested meaning, is that on which mountain and for how long did this one perform penance, and what might be its name? For the young parrot pecks the fruit so red as your lips. So the first meaning, maybe just talking about that 3 persons are gathering as flowers of gold from the earth, and the bold and the learned and he who knows how to serve. So it's the meaning is quite clear here. But in the second poetry, the meaning, you try to connect the dots. That, for example, in the last sentence, for the young parrot pecks the fruit so red as your lips. So the fruit is so red that it is referring to your lips, that your red lips are so attractive that I want to touch them, or I want to feel them. And on which mountain and for how long did this one perform penance, and what might be its name? So what he's trying to understand, what could be her name, and how I have seen her, that she's so beautiful, but what could be she, that I want to know more about her. So this is how you are connecting the dots here. And the first poetry is not leading you to any suggestive meanings, is that the meaning is quite clear. So this is what I was trying to say, that first is only trying to refer you to an explicit meaning, but the second one is leading you to another tier of meaning, which is the suggestive meaning. The Sanskrit poet critic further asserts that indication should not be mistaken for suggestion, again, because there is a vital difference in nature between the two. Indication is merely metaphorical application. Okay, as I said that this here in the second, that there is an indication, the suggested meaning is there, but it does not happen all the time. Okay, there is a suggested meaning, but this should not be a conclusion that always the explicit meaning has to lead you to a suggested meaning. This is what is mentioned here, that there is a vital difference in nature between the two being that the indication should not be mistaken for suggestion. Okay, it can be the secondary meaning, but it does not have to be the suggested meaning. Suggested meaning is the ultimate meaning. It cannot be termed as the explicit meaning, it cannot be termed as the secondary meaning. It is the hidden meaning that you have to understand. Anandavardhan asserts that of all the sentiments, the erotic is the most delectable, and that the poetry that is full of this sentiment is certain to please. One is reminded of the Aham conventions from Sangam literature, when he observes that the erotic sentiment falls into the twofold division of love in union and love in separation. That is what we understand when we are reading Aham poetry. The first of which, that is the love in union, uh, the first of which may be spoken in terms of exchange of love glances, dalliance, honeymoon, and so on. And the second, which is the love in separation. It may be grouped into desire, it may be grouped into jealousy or separation, journey, and so forth. So this is quite clear. And proper portrayal of the rise and fall of the sentiment, sustaining the unity of the principal sentiment from beginning to end, and discrete use of figures of speech are the conditions that govern the suggestiveness of a whole work of art. Okay, so there are figures of speeches that are figures of speech that are involved, but they may lead you to the suggested meaning and they may not lead you to the suggested meaning, but the figures of speech are there. It depends on you that you connect the dots and you reach the suggested meaning. So that is the main basic principle that governs the suggested whole work of art, be it a text, be it a section of poetry. And only one of the many sentiments in a literary work should be made dominant by the poet who aims at greatness. And only the poem in which the suggested meaning sense is exclusively important deserves the name of Dhwani. As I had even mentioned in the previous slide, that only it is only in the few sections of poetry where you can somehow
கண்டினியூ பண்ணிருந்தானே இருக்கணும். அவங்க
where you
சொல்லுங்கல்ல அந்த டோர்வின்னு அது நமக்கு 2 மாசத்துக்கு தான் கொடுத்துருக்காங்களே.
I'm sorry, somebody is I think
Please unmute yourself.
Oh, so it was not meant for me. Okay. So only the poem in which the suggested sense is exclusively important deserves the name of Dhwani. That is clarification, that it depends on you if you get the suggested meaning. Only it is the final process that you say that, okay, the Dhwani concept has been analyzed here, has been used here. When the implied sense is subordinate to the expressed, what results is Gunibhut Vyangya, that is the poetry of subordinated suggestion. What is the meaning of the sentence? That the implied meaning, okay, the meaning that you get while reading, the secondary meaning that you get after reading a section of poetry or after reading a literary text, when it is subordinate to the expressed, the implied meaning gets suppressed by the expressed meaning. What results is that Gunibhut Vyangya, that is the poetry of subordinated suggestion. That is another classification of suggested meaning, that the explicit meaning stands apart from the implied meaning. The implied meaning is not standing as important here. The expressed meaning stands as important here, and that is what you call Gunibhut Vyangya. Vyangya is sarcasm in English. So the poetry that is devoid of the power to suggest, that has no suggested meaning and owes its existence only to the striking nature of its explicit meanings and the expressions that denote them, is called chitra or portrait. So what it's quite clear that poetry or any literary work of art that does not have the power to suggest, that you think that only the explicit meaning is important here, it is merely called as chitra or portrait of something. And Anandavardhan says that it is not poetry in the strict sense of the term, but only an imitation of poetry. So basically what he's concentrating on is that a work of poetry has to have a suggested meaning to be termed as poetry. It does not have to stand as having only an explicit meaning. Then you cannot call it poetry. You can only call it as imitation of poetry. And many of us would be aware of Plato's work of Republic. In book 10, he has also talked about the concept of mimesis, and which was basically which was countered by Aristotle, that you cannot say that that poetry has no meaning. So it is it for me or? Ma'am, can I continue or?
कंटिन्यू खत्म
All
करें
right,
तो कंसल्टेट कर.
Okay, sorry. So, so Anandavardhan says that it is not poetry in the strict sense of the term, but only an imitation of poetry. Okay, so so he's basically giving us a hint that suggested meaning is something that has to be there, which the work of poetry has to be called as the work of poetry. So though many varieties of suggestor relationship are possible, the poet should be mainly concerned with only one of them, that is suggestion of sentiments, as I said. So this assertion by the great aesthetician, that is Anandavardhan, makes it clear that there is no conflict between the theory of Dhwani and the theory of rasa. If the former underscores the method of treatment, the latter deals with the ultimate effect. As I said, that it is only through Dhwani that you reach to rasa. If Dhwani is not there, you cannot reach rasa. And so this is what he's saying, that there has to be no conflict between the two. The both exist, and both exist as, you know, supporting each other. The concept of Dhwani has to have which literally means flesh, but it does not have to you know, exist without rasa. It exists because rasa is there. So there has to be a connection between the both of them. On close examination, Iraichi appears to be akin to Dhwani when it comes to comparing the two. It appears to be, and again, I would like to say that Anandavardhan was influenced by Tolkapier's text of Tolkapiam, that he finally came to an understanding that in Sanskrit we could talk about Dhwani. So it is not vice versa, it is that Anandavardhan was influenced. So Iraichi appears to be more akin to Dhwani than Ulurai, the one vital difference between the Tamil and Sanskrit concept being that, being that Dhwani may not depend on similes or metaphors. So, sorry. So it is, so what is happening, that Dhwani is more akin to Iraichi, and Ulurai doesn't have to be that connected with Dhwani. And the vital difference between Tamil and Sanskrit concept being that Dhwani may not depend on similes or metaphors. In what I discussed in Iraichi and Ulurai, that there were similes and metaphors involved, but those similes and metaphors are also there in when it comes to understand a section of poetry in Sanskrit, but they do not have to be one of the most important aspect to understand Dhwani. and Dhwani does not depend on them, but Ulura and Iraichi depend on the use of similes and metaphors. So Iraichi, as we remember, it is again the deeper meaning that we have to understand. But whereas Ulura is somehow the explicit meaning, you can get it while reading. So again, the main difference between Iraichi and Ulurai lies in the way they are put to use. So it is only how you use, how you talk about it, that it depends on you and the poet who has framed the work of poetry. So in Ulurai, there is a one-to-one correspondence. Okay, I'm sorry. In Ulurai, there is a one-to-one correspondence between the corporal items and what they stand for in the implied meaning of the poem. Iraichi does not demand this kind of correspondence. Now there is a bit difference, as even if I talked about the difference, there is another difference, that there is one-to-one correspondence between the corporal items, that the objects that are involved in the sections of poetry, there is a connection between them, and you can get it while reading while reading poetry. You can connect the dots, that okay, this object is connected to this person. So there is a connection between artificial and the humans that are involved. But Iraichi does not demand this kind of correspondence. It is for this reason that Ulura is considered more artificial than Iraichi and Dhwani. What is happening is that even if there is an explicit meaning, but the importance lies that you reach the suggested meaning. There is the importance that is lying. So whereas Iraichi is confined to aham poetry alone, Dhwani is applicable to all kinds of subject matter. This is another important difference, that Iraichi, which is the deeper emotional understanding of the poetry to reach the suggested meaning, it is confined to aham poetry, as I said in the beginning, but Dhwani is applicable to every section of poetry, every subject matter. Anandavardhan is also of the view that the erotic sentiment is intrinsic to Dhwani, that erotic sentiment is there. As I talked about in the previous slide, that he appreciates that erotic element has to be there so that you feel pleasure, that you feel delight. And so it's intrinsic to Dhwani. So most of the examples that he gives to illustrate the different types of Dhwani are poems that treat love and lovers as moods and emotions, because he's implying that the erotic meaning is there. When he says that Dhwani may be understood and appreciated only by mature readers, he speaks of love in union and love in separation. And when he discusses in detail the question of decorum and propriety in erotic poetry, one cannot help feeling that Anandavardhan might have been feeling with and inspired by the Tamil concepts of Iraichi and Ulurai. So, okay, when erotic element is there, he's talking about love in union, love in separation. But when he's talking about the decorum, when the erotic element is not there, he is saying that I am influenced by Tolkappiyar's text of Tolkappiyam, where Iraichi and Ulurai are involved. So this is the most important thing, that once you exclude the erotic element, there comes the influence of Tolkappiyar's Tolkappiyam. Porulati sections of Aham and Puram poetries. That is where he gets influenced by Tolkappiyar's Tolkappiyam. That is it. So thank you for being the patient listeners. I hope I was able to make my point